The Blazar Remus are some of the most popular, affordable anamorphic lenses out there. They're probably the best bang for your buck if you're looking to achieve a stylized anamorphic look without selling your car in order to afford a couple of lenses. However, the lenses they look to emulate are the Atlas Mercury series. And after owning one and shooting with it extensively for the last few months, I can say that despite being around 10x the price, the Atlas Mercury are worth every penny. Let me explain. So a few months back, I secretly started using a new lens for almost all of my videos, and I was curious if anyone would notice. And let me just say, y'all noticed, because I started getting loads of comments asking what lens or gear I was using to get this look to my videos. So for the rest of this video, I want to talk to you about that look, why these lenses are so special, and help you figure out if they're worth the price. Obviously, the more expensive lens is gonna be better. And this is a little bit of a weird video for me to make because usually I'm the one telling you that you don't need to buy the expensive thing. So I guess I'm just gonna need to really prove that the Mercury is significantly better than the Remus. Now, before you call me a shill, I purchased these on my own. I own this 36mm Mercury, and I own a Blazar A set, but Johnny Rome's is letting me borrow the 33 Blazar for a little bit more direct comparison to the Atlas 36. That was actually kind of the inspiration for this video. While I've been shooting on the Mercury, Johnny has been using the 33 Blazar, and since we shoot together so much, we often share footage, and it quickly became apparent how different these lenses are. But there are obviously a few similarities too. They kind of look the same with their, silver coloring and all that stuff. They both cover full frame sensors, they're both 1.5x D-squeeze, and they both have fast apertures. The Mercury set are all t2.2 maximum aperture, whereas each Blazar is a little bit different. The 33 is a t1.8, the 45 to 65 are t2, and then the 85 and the 100 are t2.8, and then I think the 125 is t4. Whatever, they're fast. So the look of the Atlas Mercury is very distinct. It's decidedly not clinical like the G Master lens that I'm filming this on right now. Some people call these things flaws. I call them character. And the reason that you'd call them character is because if you're shooting anamorphic, it's because you want a certain look to your videos. If you want perfection, there are plenty of lenses like these G Masters out there for you. I think the first characteristic that's worth talking about is the distortion, because there's a lot of it. Both these lens sets have a ton of barrel distortion, which is especially more noticeable on the wider angle versions of these lenses that I've tended to use most frequently. The edges kind of bow out on the side, which can be annoying, but the secondary effects end up being what give these lenses a lot of their look. When paired with the anamorphic oval-shaped bokeh, that barrel distortion helps to stretch out the ovals such that it creates this incredible swirling background. It's kind of like the vintage Helios lenses or the Hawk anamorphic lenses, which were used in Shogun. I also much prefer barrel distortion over pin cushion distortion because it makes the image feel like it's kind of popping out at you, giving you more of a 3D feel rather than feeling flat or like you're being sucked in. So when picking an anamorphic lens, this was one thing that was a big draw for me choosing the Atlas Mercury. Now, the downside of this intense barrel distortion is that the edges of the frame get pretty warped, and this can limit your ability to frame your subject to anything but center framing. This is one area where the Atlas Mercury really outshines the Blazar lenses, however. Yes, you do still have a bunch of that distortion, but the amount of usable real estate you have on the frame is much better on the Mercuries. Like if you put your subject towards the edge of the frame, you still have decent sharpness. Your subject doesn't look like a completely distorted, squished mess. On the Blazars, you still have that similar barrel distortion, but on the very edges, you get a little bit of additional stretching to it. This creates some weird squishing when your subject is framed on the edges. And it becomes really obvious and jarring when you have your subject moving through the frame or when you're panning across a subject. Like truly anything other than center framing on the Blazar Remus becomes kind of unusable. Is this manageable? Yes. Do I often use center framing anyways? Also yes, but it does limit your storytelling quite a bit. Another characteristic worth talking about in a little bit greater detail is the sharpness. Now, this is a little bit tricky because it sort of includes a lot of the overlapping lens characteristics like chromatic aberration and distortion and just the weirdnesses of resolution differences for anamorphic lenses, but the simplest way to put it is that the sharpness on the Atlas Mercury makes it just much more versatile. Like most lenses, it's sharper in the center and slowly gets softer towards the edges. This is partially because there's more chromatic aberration towards the edges, but you also see more of that distortion we're talking about towards the edge as well. Now, as you stop down from T2.2 to 2.8 and T4 and so on, the sharpness improves considerably. And I don't think I'm saying anything groundbreaking here, since almost all lenses perform in this way. Sharper at the center, weaker at the edges as you stop down. It gets better. Crazy, I know. But the sharpness of the Atlas Mercury is honestly very impressive for a lens with this much character. Basically, like, the thing that's in focus is sharp, and then all the other stuff around it is where you see all that kind of messy goodness. It's still completely usable at T2.2 wide open, very solid at T2.8, and basically T4 and on is pretty much clean. The sharpness of the Blazar Remus, it changes substantially as you stop down. I'd say for the most part, it's nearly unusable wide open. Like, it's much harder to nail focus because not only is the focal plane very slim, but the distortion and aberration makes it so that, like, the latitudinal plane is also very slim. So if you're not directly in the center and at the right focal plane, you're gonna miss. Plus, it just really isn't that sharp, which is partially due to some very significant chromatic aberration throughout the image. There's this reddish purple fringing towards the center and then more bluish greenish fringing toward the edges. Now, because I own the set, I mostly use the A series lenses, so like the 45mm version of this lens. And for that, I very rarely feel comfortable with the image at anything wider than T4, which obviously has very many limitations for things like low light, for example. Now, I will say the B set are much better at controlling their chromatic aberration, and it is also a little bit sharper. So that's the 33, the 50, and the 85mm versions of this lens. But still, I think they go a little bit beyond having character and are just a little bit too messy if you're wider than T4. I don't really love doing these lens charts because I think they're pretty boring, but I do think it's the easiest way to get a quick sense of what's going on with each lens. You can see off the bat, the Mercury is very sharp wide open, especially in the center. And then if you look out to the edges, even though you can see things start to fall off, you can still make out some of the detail on the edge of the chart. Compare this to T2.4 on the Remus, and you can see that chromatic aberration we're talking about in the center. And then if you look out to the edges, we basically can't make out anything. As we stop down on the Mercury, it just continues to clean up really nicely. Whereas the Remus, it starts out very messy, and then it takes until around T5.6 to get the same edge sharpness that we would at T2.8 on the Mercury. So what about those tasty cinematic lens flares that are so characteristic of anamorphic lenses? Well, the Atlas Mercury, in my opinion, is some of the most fun lens flares on any lens out there. They only come in an amber option, but as someone who's mostly shooting in natural light in outdoor scenarios for my travel and adventure stuff, I really like that amber look. I think it's more natural and pleasing than the more traditional blue. The primary flares on these things are wicked. They're super distinct and sharp, but the rest of the image still holds up pretty nicely without getting too washed out. Where I think they really show their character though is on that sort of secondary flaring. You just get a whole lot of these amber elements coming in, and again, I personally really like the look. And if I'm going anamorphic, let's go for it. But I know that these could be a little bit too much for some people, so I understand if that is too much flare for what you're looking for. The Blazars, on the other hand, they have the option for silver, blue, or amber. So if you prefer a different look, they've got those covered for you as well. I went for silver on my set, and while I do love the look of the amber on the Mercury, I do think if I had a choice, I would probably go for silver. The flares themselves on the Blazar, they're nice, but they're not particularly unique. They're a little bit more subdued compared to the Mercury, and they don't have a lot of that secondariness that we were talking about there. So you can make that decision if that's more the style that you're looking for, but I personally much prefer the Mercury. I also want to talk about the build of each of these lenses because it creates some interesting pros and cons to consider. The Atlas Mercuries are built like tanks. They're basically just full metal construction, no plastic except for the lens cap itself. And I can tell that these are going to survive some heavy usage. I'm pretty rough on my gear, and I have taken these things traveling with me quite a bit, and I have by no means babied them. Aside from a few little cosmetic scratches here and there from, you know, like placing it down on rocks, these things are gonna hold up really nicely. The focus and aperture rings are also perfectly dampened for handheld shooting. And I know this is very hard to convey in a video, but they're just so much better. They're just like the perfect dampness compared to the Blazars, which are they're just not quite the same. Being built like a tank though can have some downsides, obviously. The first being these things are much, much bigger. Like they're small by professional anamorphic standards, but they're obviously much larger than the Blazar lenses. The 36, 42, and 54 are super manageable, however, and I did have a chance to try out the newer wider angle lenses that they're working on at NAB, and those are really compact as well. But the telephoto version, so anything above the 54, massive, and they're much too big for my personal style of run and gun shooting. They're gonna be hard to balance on a gimbal. They're big lenses. Another downside is that there's no threadable front thread on these, which is super normal for high-end cinema lenses, but it just means you're gonna have to use a large clamp style matte box to use any filters rather than the standard threadable front filters like the 77mm threads that are on all of the Remuses. Now, I use the Mofage Poco PL adapter, which has the filter slot behind the lens, so this hasn't been a huge issue to me, but it is something worth keeping in mind. The Blazars are much, much smaller, so they're also gonna be much better suited for like gimbal work, for example. Or if you're looking for just a more lightweight kit, these are definitely gonna be a better option from that standpoint. And they're still built well, but they're certainly not as robust as the Atlas, and that's fine. Plastic rings, it's okay. They do fine, they're just not quite as nice. But all in all, I do think that they are very well built for the price. So, is the Atlas Mercury worth it? I mean, honestly, probably not. It's pretty hard to justify an $8,000 purchase for one lens when you can get a 5-lens Remus kit for like $4,600, and that's after they've increased their prices a little bit. Admittedly, I got my Mercury secondhand for $6,000, which felt like a steal and is really the reason that I went for it. Plus, the Remus are actually something you can easily purchase, whereas I've heard of folks being on wait lists for months waiting to get their Mercury orders fulfilled. But the look that you get from the Mercury lenses is absolutely incredible. And even if you're trying to achieve a similar look with the Remus, it just isn't quite the same. Like, on the whole, I think the Atlas Mercuries are just like the perfect balance between clinical and character. They're super unique and have an interesting look without the drawbacks of being unsharp or too distorted to actually effectively tell your story. They're sharp, but not so much that it looks like things are, you know, modern and clinical. They have some distortion, but not so much that you can't make use of all parts of your frame. They give your image this just like richness and contrast that I just don't think you get on the Blazar lenses. They have this like warmth and saturatedness to them as well without feeling too much. Maybe I'm just trying to justify spending so much money, but I think I would do it again in a heartbeat. I think my recommendation might be to do what I've done. Get the Mercury for the focal length that you can see yourself using the most, and then use the Remuses to kind of complement that with other focal lengths. Because while they're by no means as good, they do still have a pretty similar look, and I think for continuity's sake, you can get away with mixing in some Remus lenses in your footage. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.